My name is Sophie Pinkham.
I was born in New York. I live in New York now. I don't have a Ukrainian background, but after college, I became involved in working in international public health, especially in issues related to HIV and to drug policy. And I ended up working for George Soros Foundation, the Open Society Institute it was called then. It's now called the Open Society Foundation. And our work was focused mostly in post-Soviet states, and especially in Ukraine, actually, because Ukraine had, relatively speaking, a much stronger sort of civil society, more sort of civic engagement. And so there were a lot of sort of thriving NGOs, and I worked with a lot of fantastic activists in Ukraine while I was working for the Society Institute. And then I ended up getting a Fulbright grant to go and live in Ukraine. And it's a bit strange, but I got a grant to study Russian. They don't give those anymore, but they used to. So I got a grant to study in Ukraine, and then I stayed and I did a research project about AIDS activism and women's rights activism in Ukraine. And so my book is about, and now I'm in the Slavic department at Columbia University, and I work on literature and culture history. But I wrote the book. It was sort of triggered by Maidan, of course, and by the revolution, and that was sort of when I conceived of the book. And it spans 10 years pretty much. It's sort of an even decade. And so the book starts with my first trip to Russia, actually, when I went to Irkutsk and in Siberia and worked at a public health organization there at the Red Cross, and became very interested in drug policy issues and HIV. And then sort of proceeds through my work in public health, the time I lived in Ukraine, sort of travels, adventures. There's a chapter in Crimea, a chapter in the Carpathians, and then the second half of the book is about Maidan and the war, sort of the aftermath of Maidan, and goes up to about a year ago. And so the book is organized around personal experience, but it weaves together many different elements. So there's a lot about literature, there's a lot about culture, there's some about art, there's a lot about history, and it sort of explores the many different sort of cultural threads that make up Ukraine today. Yeah, I mean, I've always really liked to travel. Part of my family is French, so I grew up often going to Europe. And I've been traveling, since I was a teenager, pretty extensively. But I really, I loved Ukraine from the first time I arrived. I think that Ukrainian culture is very distinctive in its openness and friendliness. And I'm very interested in Soviet history and in the history of the Russian Empire. But I did always have the feeling going to Ukraine that it was much more opening, much more welcome to foreigners, and especially more welcoming to Americans than Russia is, of course. Ukraine is sort of a cultural crossroads in so many ways. And I should say that the reason that the book is called Black Square, it's partly a reference to Maidan, to Independence Square, obviously, but it's also a reference to the painting by Malevich, the suprematist. So he was this very famous, sort of iconic avant-garde painter in the early part of the 20th century. And I chose the title partly because Malevich's idea was, in a sense, about sort of the end of history. His artistic philosophy was that eventually you could sort of reach this zero point through revolution where time essentially would end, which is pretty wild, but I think has an interesting parallel with the ideas about sort of the history that were in circulation after the Soviet Union fell, and which I think have now been pretty obviously debunked. But Malevich is also, I think, a great example of the sort of multilingual and multicultural aspect of Ukraine and of Ukrainian history, because he came from a Polish family. He was born in Kyiv, but he is identified. I mean, most people think of him as a Russian painter. And that I loved about Ukraine was that you felt so many different currents. You have the Tatars in Crimea and sort of the influence of the Ottoman Empire in Crimea and in southern Ukraine. You have, of course, the Russian influence. You have the influence of Poland and sort of other more Western European influences that came in from the West and through Western Ukraine. There's such diverse architecture. I also find the linguistic situation in Ukraine to be very interesting. I think it's partly because I'm from New York City, which is such a multilingual city, but especially sort of a bilingual city in terms of Spanish and English. And there's so much mixing and so much sort of interaction of the two languages. And I found it very interesting and very sort of appealing how, most people in Ukraine are bilingual or even speak more languages than two. And I think that there's a lot of sort of exciting linguistic synergy going on in Ukraine. Well, I was traveling there regularly for my job and moved there, and I was living there pretty much for 2.5 years, but I still go back very frequently, and I have a lot of really close friends there, so I try to go back every year at least. But I mean, one of the sort of wonderful things about Kyiv, I think, specifically as a city, and then also about Lviv, notably, or Odessa, actually, is that they weren't destroyed during the war, and so you can see quite clearly multiple historical periods, especially in central Kyiv. If you're talking about Kyiv, there's Sophia. There are these incredible cathedrals from many different periods that are pre-revolutionary. There are quite a lot of quite interesting Soviet buildings, and then you see the more modern structures, which I don't like as much, but you sort of see, it's like you can see history unfolding as you walk through the streets. And there's a lot of really interesting architecture in Kyiv. I also really love how Kyiv is so hilly and so green, how there are so many parks. I find that very distinctive. And then in terms of culture, a lot of my book is about sort of youth culture and especially about music. I'm very interested in music, and through chance or preference, I ended up being friends with and spending time with a lot of musicians, most of whom play sort of some kind of traditional or semi-traditional music. So some of them play Ukrainian music, some of them play sort of urban folklore music that's more associated with the Soviet Union. Some play Balkan music. A lot of them play some mixture of that. And then I have one close friend who, it's interesting actually, he is a Russian Jew from Zhadan, but he moved to Ukraine to play klezmer music. And so he has a klezmer band that actually played on the stage in Maidan. So it's called Pushkin Klezmer Band. And it's called a klezmer band, but they really mix many different genres. And one of them is a Crimean Tatar. So they have that. That's a pretty strong influence in their music. And their guitarist is an excellent jazz guitarist. So again, it's sort of this interesting synthesis of many different traditions and of old and yeah, I'm definitely a writer by nature, and sort of a voracious reader from early childhood, and also a diary keeper. And I think that whenever you travel, you should always write everything down. And that's what I teach at Columbia. And I always tell all of my students, write everything down. Even if you don't know what you'll do with your notes later, you'll be happy to have them, even if it's only so that you can look at them or your children can look at them. But for me, I was very happy that I did it because, I was traveling in Ukraine and having a lot of interesting experiences. And I had always just had the instinct to write things down and had always wanted to be a writer. But I didn't know if I would ever be able to, write a book about Ukraine. And then once I was writing about Ukraine, I was extremely happy that I had these, piles of notebooks with all of my impressions stored up. Well, I was actually very lucky because it was a strange situation because I was so interested in Ukraine and I had this large body of experience actually from living there and everything. But in some ways, and I had started writing, I had started doing sort of writing literary nonfiction and doing a little bit of journalism. But the problem was that before Maidan, it was just almost impossible to publish anything about Ukraine. In the general marketplace, there just wasn't, unfortunately, very much interest in it. People wanted to hear about Russia, but not about Ukraine. And then Maidan happened, and suddenly everybody wanted to know about Ukraine, but very few people knew, very few writers really knew anything substantial about Ukraine. And so I was very lucky in that I started writing short pieces while Maidan was going on. And then I was actually asked to put together a book proposal by an editor. But there, the logic was about Maidan, so I had to think about sort of how I could structure it in terms of what made Maidan possible, how did we get to this point in Ukrainian sort of history and politics. And it was tough also. I mean, as a writer, organizationally, and in terms of keeping up with current events and sort of emotionally, it was very difficult because I was writing, as things were unfolding and as the war was going on. It was really painful to watch. And it's difficult to try to write while things are still happening. It's easier when you're able to look at things in retrospect. No, I mean, it's not just about my experience. I used a lot of sources. I did a huge amount of reading, both of scholarly sources, of literary sources, and also of journalism that people were writing. But I think first of all, because there was very little sort of pre-existing knowledge of Ukraine sort of within the Western media, and also because it had just become such a crazy, overheated environment politically with so much propaganda and all of these accusations, and they're fascist, they're not fascist, who's a fascist, just really uninformed and really wild things being said from many directions. So I think it was really important to be very thoughtful about which sources I trusted and which sources I valued. But fortunately, I mean, there are a bunch of very good historians who work on Ukraine. You just have to know how to find them. And there were some very good Westerners who wrote about Ukraine too. It was just sort of an issue of trying to understand who was for real, who really knew what they were talking about, and who was just sort of repeating nonsense or exaggerating things or passing on various types of propaganda. What I wrote is definitely deeply personal, and it is subjective. It's openly subjective, right? It's sort of about my experience and about sort of my own perception as an individual, but at the same time, I tried really hard to have it be informed by a solid background of, good history, of responsible journalism, about the different issues that I wrote about. So, I want to be connected to reality. But I think that there's always a personal and a subjective element. I don't really think that you can write about culture, that you can write about observations of a place, your experience of a country in an objective way. It's not math. It's all about human interactions and human perceptions. And so part of what I do in this book was to sort of explicitly reject the idea of like the Ukraine expert, the person who, the talking head on CNN who's just like, I know exactly what's happening now and I know what's happening in the future and and let me explain it to you in 2 minutes, and I see that and I'm just like, you're not a fortune teller. You don't know what's going to happen in the future. And one of the funniest things, I think, is to read political science predictions 10 years later because they're almost always wrong. You can't predict the future. And, different people have different experiences of events, and there are some things that are factual, of course. I don't think that reality is completely relative, but I think that there are many ways of perceiving a situation. And I think that it's really important, first of all, to acknowledge that your experience is always sort of shaped by particular aspects of sort of who you are, where you are, what you knew before, and so on. And also that different people have different experiences. And I think that it's important to be willing to sort of consider those and not shut them out just because they seem different from what you believe. Yeah, well, I would say that, writing, I think, comes naturally to me, but there was a huge amount of work of sort of filtering out which parts of my experience I wanted to include, right? Because when you look at 10 years of your life, there's so many things that happen and so many impressions and so many people that you meet. But when you get into a literary narrative, you have to exclude a lot, and you have to sort of find the main threads. I had to sort of decide which people would be sort of the main characters in my narrative. There were some people who I chose not to write about, just not care about them or think they were interesting, but because I needed to have sort of a strong, coherent narrative. And so, yeah, in terms of choosing your characters, in terms of choosing your themes, and just in terms of which things to put in and which things to leave out, I'd say I think by nature I'm very, very sort of curious and just enthusiastic about seeing things and finding things out and writing about them in general. And so actually, and also I have access to a very good academic library at Columbia. So for me, actually, one of the challenges was stopping myself from finding out everything, because I would sort of become curious about something and just want to know everything about, who are the Cossacks and how did their culture form and where did they come from? What's their history? And then, I have like 15 books about the Cossacks, and then I read some of them, but I was like, okay, I can't. I can't include all of this. I have to be selective and be sort of disciplined in making sure that it has a arc. Yeah, I think actually in writing, probably the most important skill, and I would say that the thing that took me the longest to learn, is being willing to delete a huge amount of what you write. What I wrote about 3 times as much as what made it into the book. And you have to really just be ruthlessly cut. I knew almost no writers for whatever reason. I know a lot of musicians and quite a lot of visual artists, but not very many writers for some. I'm very interested in Zhadan, of course. I think his work is really interesting. And one of my friends has been co-translating his work, and they've been doing great translations, actually, of Zhadan's work. They recently translated Voroshilovgrad, and it's a really good translation. And reading that book is just astonishing after the war, because he wrote it before the conflict began at all. But it's so prescient, and it's so relevant to the sort of cultural conflict between Eastern Ukraine and the West and the rest of Ukraine. So I think he's really interesting. But I didn't know too many writers there, unfortunately. I would say that the biggest observation that I would sort of like to share and would like people to understand is that, in my opinion, Ukraine is really a culture that is made great by its pluralism and by the way that it includes many different cultures and many different languages. And that's shaped Ukrainian culture, and I think that's something that really should be celebrated. And I really reject the idea, which was circulating in the Western media, of sort of there are ethnic Ukrainians and there are ethnic Russians, and they hate each other and they want to kill each other, and that's all. When you spend, obviously not true. It's so much more complicated than that, and there's no reason it has to be that way. I don't think that there's sort of an essentialized reason for that, right? Obviously, there are a lot of political factors, and Putin and Russia have had a very negative effect on Ukraine today. But in terms of just, Russian people or Russian speakers in Ukraine and Ukrainian speakers, they're not sort of mutually exclusive groups that hate each other. And there are other threads too. There's the Polish thread, there's the Tatar thread, there are the Hutsuls, there are the Rusin, there are so many different people. And I think that's part of what makes Ukrainian culture so interesting and so compelling. No, I don't think so. I will go back probably this summer, but just to see my friends. I was there in July. Actually, I went in July, and I visited a friend of mine who is doing really great work with an organization called Mercy Corps, and they are working in frontline towns. I went to Lugansk, the controlled part of Lugansk, and went around with him, sort of visiting Mercy Corps grantees, and They do small grants to help people sort of get their businesses back up or sort of restart some kind of income activity. A lot of the people are refugees. A lot of their homes have been destroyed. And it was really sad, obviously, but it was very inspiring to see all the help that was being given by Mercy Corps and the sort of energy and commitment that people had to sort of starting new lives. And then I was in Ukraine again in September and October. I'll go back this summer, but now I'm going to write my dissertation, which is about Russian writer cult and their, specifically the Pushkin cult, actually, in late Soviet and contemporary Russian culture and its connection to nationalism. Well, I think they should buy it. They should, because frankly, it's very difficult to talk about Ukraine in the United States and probably in Canada. So anything people can do to sort of share it or spread the word would be much appreciated so that we can continue having mainstream books about these topics that I think are totally fascinating and that people really enjoy learning about, but that have a lot of trouble breaking into the sort of mainstream marketplace.